Okay, good evening. This week we have the privilege of reading a double parsha of chukas and balak together, which is really, it's interesting. A number of the double parshios that we have are often not necessarily the most riveting of material, right? So we have, for instance, Vayakel, Pekude, both of which are about the fine details of the Mishkan, or Tazria Mitzorah, right, which complement each other, but again, very technical kinds of parshios that deal with the world of Tuman Tahara, of Tzaras, and things of that nature. Chukas balak are jam-packed parshios that you could probably divide each of these parshios in half and have a tremendous amount of material to work with. So I want to share an idea on both parshios that hopefully will be worthwhile and meaningful. So the first is Parshas chukas, which in many ways has a very tragic beginning. The Parshas chukas is a parsha that is fundamentally a parsha of transition, right? Parshas Korach, which we read last week, deals the last accounts of the events of the very beginning of the Jews' sojourn in the Midbar, the revolt of Korach, right? And there's a debate among the Mefarshim whether the events of Korach take place before the spies or immediately after the spies. But it's a question of 3 months in one direction, maybe 3 months in the other, right? It really brings us into the first 18 months after Yetzias Mitzrayim, and then the Torah makes a tremendous jump, right? That you come into Parshas chukas, and suddenly we are holding in the last year in the wilderness, right? The Bnei Yisrael are now once again on the cusp of entry into Eretz Yisrael, right? That Moshe's personal and career dream of bringing the Jewish people into Eretz Yisrael is about to be realized. And then there is this mysterious incident, which leads to this being snatched from the jaws of victory, as it were, right? That a whole generation has passed. It's time to enter Eretz Yisrael, and that Moshe and Aaron as well are barred from entry. And what's interesting is that I think people are very familiar with the approach of Rashi based on the Midrash, that the sin of Moshe was his failure to speak to the rock, right? That he was told to speak to the rock. And instead it says that he hits him. That was a breakdown, right? In what would happen. And that is the sin, right, that essentially ends Moshe's leadership. So what's interesting is that the Torah never explicitly says, right, what the sin was, right? The Torah says that there is a failure to sanctify God's name, which we know even today, right? The concept of Kiddush Hashem, the question of how do we sanctify God's name is a definitionally amorphous one, right? That there's a subjective dimension, what is actually Kiddush Hashem? And so the question is, what is the sin of Moshe and Aaron? So my first point, it's important to know that the Torah does not address this directly. In Rashi's opinion, while obviously significant, is not the only approach. So there is a fascinating Abravanel. And I would suggest those of you who are, to the best of my knowledge, no one's done a complete translation of the Abravanel to English. But if you're comfortable with the Hebrew, it's a fascinating Abravanel, long Abravanel. We're going to actually, in my class on the Rishonim, going to deal with the Abravanel very shortly, who wrote really a fascinating commentary on the Torah. The Abravanel cites 10 opinions, right, prior to his time in the 15th century that had been advanced to explain what is the sin of Moshe and Aaron. So I heard quoted recently that Usher Weiss said, in a different connotation than halacha, but sometimes when you have a question that you have so many answers to, that is proof that none of the questions have significantly answered the question. So I want to share with you just a number of these possibilities to think over. And he presents, we don't have time to go through the entire list or to go through all of his. He presents each one and shows the objections to each of them and presents his own. So I'm going to go through a few of them just as kind of the beginning of an exercise of trying to understand how difficult this section is. Opinion number 2 is the idea that Moshe is addressing the Jewish people, right, in a disparaging way, right? Says, Shimuna Hamorim, listen, please, you rebels, right? And the idea that is his failure to sanctify God, right? And that not treating Klal Yisrael with sufficient respect, right? And that the idea that on some level, right, led to this breakdown. Now, again, the Abravanel points out that this is not the last time Moshe does this. He actually does this in Sefer Devarim as well, right? Which would indicate if that had been his great sin, right? You would think he would try to avoid that in the future. But that's another approach, right, to what the sin was. The third, she quotes in the name of the Rambam, was that it was not necessarily the words, but the idea of anger, right? And there was the idea that Moshe displayed anger to the Jewish people, that is a breakdown in leadership, right? And again, particularly the idea that anger that is not able to be, controlled appropriately. Another opinion that he gives is the idea that Moshe and Aaron do not express thanksgiving in the form of shira to God for this miracle, right? The idea that part of the difficulty, right, that some of these Mepharshim are addressing is clearly in the end of the day, right, that while Moshe was not able to did not extract the water by speaking to the rock, certainly it is just as miraculous to hit a rock and water, right? Water does not actually, right, respond. Rocks don't respond to being hit by exuding water. And in fact, if you go back to Sefer Shemos, that is exactly what Moshe was told to do, right? So it's not a question that according to this approach, that those actions were problematic, right? It was the idea that they did not lead the Jewish people into song. And that this approach says, if you look later in Parshas chukas, we see that the Jews themselves, right, sing a song about a well, right? Az Yashir Yisrael, Be'er Chafaru Asarim, right? There's a description of the Jewish people, right, have that instinct of gratitude. And that this was a misteaching moment on the part of Moshe and Aaron, right? And it was because of that failure to teach, right, that they were punished in this way. Another approach that he suggests which he goes in the name of that the Ezra cites this as well, right? That the Jewish people had suggested, well, we want to get water from a different rock, right? It was almost like a testing event. And then Moshe refused to do that, right? He says, I'm only going to do the rock that God said, but in doing so, right, made it seem like less of a miracle. It's only from this rock, right, that God is able to work miracles. So again, I think that is a good overview. And then we'll just quickly cite the approach of the Abravanel himself. And that is that Moshe and Aaron, right, are being punished, and that this is almost like an excuse, right? And at this moment that the verdict is going down, but it's because of their roles, consciously or not, in earlier sins of the Jewish people, right? So Aaron in the Chet HaEgel, the sin of the golden calf, and Moshe for his role in the incident of the spies, right? The idea that certainly Aaron's role in the sin of the golden calf is readily understandable, right? And that Moshe's role in the sin of the spies, right? The idea that in the way that he set up the mission, right, that perhaps the seeds of failure were sown, right? Again, if one looks carefully at the way the story of the Meraglim is presented in Devarim of what God instructed him and the way that Moshe carries it out, right? Moshe expands the mission, empowering the spies in a way that, again, unwittingly, right, leads to that suggestion. And the idea that as leaders, right, the fact that they had a role on one hand, right, they weren't the sinners, right? They weren't the ones who principally did the sin. And that therefore, because of their kavod, right, because of their honor, right, the idea that when the verdict was placed on, let's say, the sin of the golden calf, right, Aaron wasn't punished at that moment, right? That Aaron did not, on the one hand, he didn't deserve to be like part of that mix with the real sinners. At the same time, right, what was said at the time, right, biyom pakti ufakadati alehem chatasam, that there's going to be a day of reckoning that comes, right, means, right, that something would have to happen. And the idea that that all of this is about the complex dynamic between a leader, right, between the leader and the led. And the idea that if those generations failed in such a way that they weren't able to enter Eretz Yisrael, right, that Moshe and Aaron, as it were enjoined to go down with the ship, right? So the fact that it was revealed, right, only at this point, right, is almost tangential to what was really going on, right? That again, basically the idea that a moment had to be found to be able to account, right, for these past debts, as it were, and this is the moment. So again, there's a lot more to go through from this, but the idea that this critical moment, right, in other words, that the rest of the story of Chumash turns on the fact that Moshe and Aaron would not be the ones bringing the Jews into Eretz Yisrael, reminding ourselves that the story itself is very complex, very mysterious, right? We don't really know with certainty what it's all about. And that there are all of these possibilities, right, that are worth discussing and exploring. And to say that in order to really get a full view, a full understanding, that each of these approaches perhaps has a piece to play, right, in trying to understand this incredible historical transition. So that's as far as chukas is concerned. So much to say about balak, but at the end of balak, we are told about the incident in Shittim, right, where the Jewish people find themselves pulled into a spiral of idolatry and licentiousness with the daughters of Midian, right? And it comes kind of to a crescendo that a person from the Jewish people, a very prominent person, who we later learn is the prince of the tribe of Shimon, Zimri ben Salu, brings a Midianite woman into the camp itself, right, in public, in front of Moshe, in front of the Jewish people. And it describes a scene, right, where Moshe and the Jewish people are crying outside of the Ohel Moed, right, which again is profoundly tragic, right? It's a moment of breakdown. It's a moment of profound challenge to the values and the mores of the Jewish people. And the reaction is one of tears. And we have to kind of break down, like, what exactly, right, what leads to those tears? So the Ezra suggests that these are tears of prayer. In other words, the idea that this act of wanton rebellion, they perhaps didn't know how to respond to, right? We know, because we know the end of the story, right, that Pinchas takes dramatic, zealous action at that moment, but the people didn't know, and in that moment, they turned to tefillah, right? They're crying, they're asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and perhaps one can say, right, that Pinchas's inspiration, right, was related to their prayer. So that's approach number one. It's not complete helplessness, it's the tears of prayer. The Chizkuni is a different explanation. And the Chizkuni says, what's about to come, we're in a situation of civil war, right? That is, and again, with I would add with tremendous resonance and almost deja vu to the sin of the golden calf, right, where the Jews are again mandated they have to go and they have to fight their own relatives. Sometimes, right? Again, in Hebrew we call a civil war a milchemet achim, a war of brothers, right? Which is in certain ways a more honest, more tragic than the somewhat sterile term civil war entails. Chizkuni says, right, that the idea that they were going to have to go and do battle against their relatives is what the tears here represent. And that brings us to a startling sefas emes. The Torah tells us when Nadav and Avihu died, right? Remember the Aaron's family, because they were engaged in the dedication of the Mishkan, were not allowed to express their mourning, and the Jewish people were supposed to cry on their behalf. So Sefas points out that this never happens in the Psukim, right? And it's interesting, we read this week about the mourning period for Aaron, right? We're going to read the end of the Torah about the mourning period for Moshe. Even though God says, right, that the Jews are supposed to cry for Nadav and Avihu, we're never told that that actually happens. So Moshe and the sefas emes says that this is where this plays itself out, right? That Nadav and Avihu, right, had they survived, right, had they not sinned, right, would have been, as it were, in the driver's seat of the next generation, right? That, Moshe and Aaron have gotten old. Aaron is gone by this point. Moshe himself only has months left to live. And that they would have been, and again, these were people who were very bold, right? And it was again, that was in their sin itself. And he quotes the Medrash that Nadav and Avihu were partially fell because they were, chomping at the bit, as it were, for their moment to take over the leadership from Moshe and Aaron, right? That at that moment, right, until Pinchas steps into the breach, there's a void, right? There's no one to be able to deal with this crisis, and he says, "Hine ata yu chaseir melakol," right? They're missing, right? They are gone. So he quotes the Zohar. The Zohar says, and again, what this means exactly is a little bit beyond my pay grade, right? That the souls of Nadav and Avihu, right, were impregnated into Pinchas, right? That somehow Pinchas spiritually, right, becomes an extension of Nadav and Avihu. In other words, at the moment, and again, here I'm extrapolating what the sefas emes says, right? Finally, Klal Yisrael are crying for the absence of Nadav and Avihu, right? And that, however exactly you want to understand this mechanism, allows them to act in the world through the person of Pinchas, right? And that those tears, right, is not an expression of yeyush, of giving up. It's actually, those are the tears, right, that allow the spirit of Nadav and Avihu, and again, whether one wants to, how literally one wants to understand that, I think is an open question, right, to be able to move within Pinchas. So again, our takeaway on this story from Balak is three perspectives on trying to understand what the tears of the Jewish people in the aftermath of the sin of Zimri are about. The Ezra, these are tears of prayer. The Chizkuni says that this shows us kind of the emotional turmoil, right, of the civil war. And sefas emes, who says that these are the tears for the long dead Nadav and Avihu, who would have been the natural transitional leaders, right, and who now are present in the world, right, as it were, through the persons of Nadav, through the person of Pinchas.